We'll audit the roles and responsibilities of key members then of the staff and management of the organization. And one of the most important roles is the role of the data owner. The data owner is the person who's responsible for the actual protection of the data. Quite often a senior manager who has been designated by law as the person who must ensure that data has been properly classified and therefore is being properly protected. So as an auditor, what do we look for? We look for whether or not the data owner has been assigned. Do they have an awareness of the threats and risks? Are they actively involved in ensuring that data is properly classified and protected? Are they receiving regular reports? And if there was to be a breach, are they ready for it? We also have, of course, data custodians. Data custodians are the people that have care of or possession or custody of the data at some point in time. Now, data custodians could be email administrators or they could be users. It's someone who has access to data that, in the end, they don't really own it. The data, for example, is owned by the organization. But if I have access to customer data, for example, I have to be aware that I have a responsibility to protect that data and to handle that data in accordance with the direction of the data owner. So, as an auditor, we would review the awareness and compliance then of data custodians to ensure that data is being handled correctly. It's not being then improperly discarded. It's being backed up as necessary, for example. And data custodians can include, of course, a majority of our IT staff. People that actually have the day-to-day operational responsibility for managing our data and managing our systems. This would include system and network administrators. We also have the roles and responsibility of security admins. A security admin sets up user profiles and ensures that our various security tools are working correctly. They quite often play a key role in an incident or an investigation. So again, as auditors, we should go in and check. Are they properly trained? Do they have the proper support? Are they properly communicating any issues and so on they find? Our data users are the people that have access to our data on a daily basis. And these can include, of course, both internal employees and sometimes even, of course, external customers. They have access to their data, and part of our responsibility is to make sure they understand how to protect themselves. We provide awareness programs even for our customers, as well as, of course, for our internal employees, that they know the liabilities and their responsibility and accountability for then how they manage data. A part of this, of course, is ensuring that all of our users have the correct level of access, that their access is not far beyond what is actually necessary for their daily responsibilities. As auditors, we'll review the identity management system to make sure that people's access is aligned with their current job, not according to the jobs they've had over the last 10 years. This is where we then ensure the enforcement of those standards such as, least privilege and need to know. Very often when we review the identity management and access control of an organization, we find that there's many user accounts still on the system for people that no longer work for the organization. These could be employees who've left, or in some cases, of course, they're contractors or temporary people that have come in as a consultant or for a short term. And the result has been that their account, which was set up for them, has remained active on the system maybe months later. And if that's not being used, okay, it's a potential problem, but not a real problem. However, we often see that when we take a look at these accounts, we find they're still being used. Maybe by a coworker. Maybe their job credentials were hard-coded into a certain program, for example. And so one of the things as auditors we should look at is to ensure that the process used when an employee or a consultant leaves is then being followed correctly to remove their access. Removing the access does not just include, of course, removing their user ID. In some cases, we will rather suspend the user ID because we might still need that user ID in a subsequent investigation. If I remove the user ID, I might actually remove access to some data that was linked to that user ID as well. So there should be a formal procedure that we follow when a person leaves the organization. The other thing is when a person leaves, quite often we're going to need them to return their laptop, their smartphone, unless they have, of course, bring your own device. They might have a secure ID token they're using to log in remotely. They could have an ID card. All of these organizational assets certainly should be recovered from that employee who's leaving. And this is especially important, of course, when we're dealing with consultants. A consultant has been in and maybe they've had fairly high-level access. But now that they're leaving, we want them also to provide proof that they have actually deleted any of our sensitive corporate information from their systems as well. They should not be able to leave our organization and take our intellectual property with them. So what are some of the other areas that the information systems auditor will review? Well, we know that one of the greatest risks to an organization is the risk brought on by change. When I make a change to a system, a change to a configuration, whether or not that's a change to a project, a change to an application, a change to a network configuration, a change to the rule base on a firewall, we know that when I make that change, I actually have a significant risk of maybe making a mistake, maybe opening up a way for someone to bypass the controls. Maybe, for example, that the change was not quite correct. So this is why one of the areas that are especially of concern to an IS auditor is to review change control and configuration management. Really, change control is a subset of configuration management. Our configuration is how things are configured. Change control is how we make changes to that configuration. And this is where we have processes that require approval, testing, and review of any change to make sure that those changes were done correctly and only authorized changes were made. A good practice for an organization is to have security baselines. A baseline says this is the threshold or this is the minimum level of security configuration that every device must have that connects to our network. Now, the idea of a security baseline is that that is the foundational level. Nobody could connect to us if they've not met that level. However, could people exceed that? Sure. A baseline is exactly that. It's the base. And so our idea as an IS auditor is to make sure we have defined baselines. So we know we have a consistent level, at least of a minimal level of protection on every system. And nobody can connect to us unless they've met at least that minimum threshold or baseline. We review to make sure those baselines are up to date, but also, of course, to make sure they are being enforced. Another area that is difficult and frustrating for many system and network administrators is the area of patch management. And patch management is trying to deploy the many patches that come out to our systems every month and to make sure that as those patches come out, they've been properly tested. Will they work on our system? Will they disable other products? They've been rolled out correctly. And of course, we've then done feedback to make sure they didn't disable something. And a good patch management system can be difficult, and many organizations struggle with this. We also want to make sure there are malware controls. Controls over the various types of malware such as we put in place anti-spam, we put in place, of course, things like anti-phishing, as well as the more commonly known antivirus types of controls. And all of these controls are then backed up by proper review and testing of that control as well. We take backups just in case we have equipment failure. But the problem, of course, is that sometimes we have found the backups didn't work. Unfortunately, there was some contamination, or maybe the backups in some way were damaged in transit or in storage. So it's important that on a regular basis we bring the backups back from our offsite location, and we review to make sure those backups are actually working. And that doesn't mean that we have to, of course, make sure that every time we do a backup we leave ourselves vulnerable. No, we move another copy out to the offsite storage as well, so that if there was to be a fire right at the time while we're testing our backups, we still do have at least another backup offsite. An area that the information systems auditor should definitely review is to make sure that we have, well, put it this way, we have a management culture for our assets. That means that instead of just buying things, we track them. We make sure we're buying the right thing. We put it into an inventory system, maybe through a configuration management database. We make sure that all of those assets are tracked as to where they are, who has a responsibility or possession of them, where is that being used. And having some type of asset inventory is essential if I'm going to manage all of the assets of the organization effectively. So when we perform an IT audit, it's important that as an information systems auditor, I have at least a level of familiarity with IT systems, the various pieces of equipment, the actual architectures themselves, as well as I have an understanding of some of the IT-related challenges, risks, and threats that we face. When we do an audit, we should always review the documentation. One of the areas that quite often is the first stumbling block is when we review the documentation and find out that the documentation is several years out of date. It no longer reflects how things are being done. So we should check, because if we had a fire, it's that documentation quite often that is the essential, should we say, element necessary to be able to rebuild our systems. Application documentation such as network configuration, all of these various documents that are necessary so that in the case of a disaster we could actually rebuild and recover our critical IT services. When we perform an audit, we should also validate the risk assessment that was used in then determining the risk response or risk treatment. The risk treatment was to apply controls where necessary to address an identified risk. And risk assessments are quite often done through a combination of different functions, such as, for example, a quantitative review, a qualitative review, such as comparing risk over a period of time. And we want to make sure that those risk assessments are actually providing a true picture of the risk. So management knows what is the level of risk they have accepted, as well as what risk still remains, that residual risk, for example. So we review the risk assessment to make sure they're thorough and complete, and certainly that the right information has been provided to management. When we audit access control systems, we'll look at things such as how are our devices then being configured and managed. When we do configuration and management of many of our network devices, we will actually connect directly to that device on a physical port, an administration port. That creates a trusted path that can be used then to do that configuration and management types of activities. One of the things we should always review then is who's tried to get on the system that shouldn't have. Maybe that needs a little bit of, should we say, investigation. Make sure that we have proper password policies on all of our systems. After all, it doesn't matter if we protect 9 of our systems perfectly. If there's a 10th system that does not have good access control and could let a person have access to the data commonly shared by all 10 applications. No password policy should be enforced consistently across all the systems of the organization. We should make sure we have session management, which includes things like, screensavers and lockout of accounts, so that if a person doesn't use their system for a certain period of time, we actually then lock out that session and try to prevent it from being used by an unauthorized individual. It's also good that we put in screen filters. So even if I'm working in an area where others might be able to look over my shoulder and see data, a good screen filter will very much limit anybody else's ability to do that shoulder surfing or setting up a camera to see what's on a person's screen, for example. And there's some very good filters out there that will prevent anyone from standing beside you being able to see what's on your screen. Session management is important to make sure that we don't have sessions which have been hijacked or could be then taken over by somebody else. And probably one of the most important controls we need to review as an information systems auditor are the controls over data coming into our systems. We'll call this input validation. And it goes right back to the term we've heard for many years already, garbage in equals garbage out. And many of the problems we have, especially like with web applications, can actually be averted through good input validation. Don't let someone put in data that could be used in, say, for example, cross-site scripting, a buffer overflow, or, of course, the very common SQL injection. All 3 of those are actually mitigated. The first step in mitigating those is, of course, don't allow any invalid input. We should also remember that we need to test physical access. Physical access, in many ways, overrides all other form of access control. Even if I have really good passwords with 2-factor authentication, that is relatively ineffective if a person is able to get access to my server room. So physical access controls are a very important part of information systems audit and should be tested on a regular basis. We should test to make sure that things like access control systems with biometrics, key cards, PIN numbers are actually then working effectively.